Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. In this week's episode, I'm interviewing Nicki Washington. In our discussion, we discussed the importance of cultural competency, which I discussed in the podcast episode that unpacked one of Nicki's papers titled, When Twice as Good Isn't Enough, The Case for Cultural Competence in Computing. So if you haven't listened to that episode yet, I highly recommend listening to it either before or after this interview so you can have some more context on some of the topics we discuss. We also discussed expanding beyond diversity by focusing on creating inclusive and equitable environments, learning from people in scholarship outside of the field, lessons learned working with CS educators across the country, lessons learned while teaching during a pandemic, focusing on the humanity and computer science education, and so much more. As always, the description in the app that you're listening to this on should link directly to the show notes. Otherwise, you can find them at jaredoleary.com, where there's nothing for sale and no advertisements. There's just hundreds, if not thousands, of free resources that you could use potentially today. In the show notes, you'll find links to many of the publications and interviews that were mentioned in this episode, as well as links to connecting with Nicki online. With that being said, we're now going to start with an introduction by Nicki.
Good afternoon. My name is Nicki Washington. I'm a professor of practice in the computer science department at Duke University. Born and raised in Durham, North Carolina. My background is computer science. For all of my degrees, I earned a bachelor's degree in computer science from Johnson C. Smith University in Charlotte, North Carolina in 2000. And then from there, my master's and PhD in computer science from North Carolina State University in 2002 and 2005. So my career in computing has kind of been from college to grad school and then quickly into industry with the Aerospace Corporation for about 1 year post-graduation. And then from there, moved to Howard University for 9 years on faculty, Winthrop University for 5 years, and now at Duke.
And can you tell me the story of how you got into computer science and CS education?
So I was exposed to computing at a very early age. My mom was a math major, and she spent her entire 34-year career at IBM as a programmer turned manager. I was exposed to computing at a very early age due to her because, of course, IBM would have discounted computers. And so my mom would every couple of years order a new one and allow me to install the software, assemble it. And then the more I did that as I aged, I started to tinker around more and learn a little bit of programming, a little bit more programming, then turned into classes in high school. And that was my introduction to computing. But I originally planned to minor in computer science and major in something business related like marketing. And so in my freshman programming course at Johnson C. Smith, my professor, Dr. Nagi Batia, realized that I was doing really well in the programming assignments in the labs. And he asked me, why is it that you are excelling in this in certain ways where other students are struggling? I've been taking programming since high school, so it's not new to me. It was new to me to learn C, but the concepts behind it weren't. And he convinced me to change my major from marketing to computer science and consider minoring in marketing. And his argument was, this was 1996 at the time. So he said, by the time you graduate in 2000, computer science will be a really popular and needed area. I think you'll do really well, especially as a young Black woman. You'll have much more opportunities than you would in marketing. So that kind of segued me into computing permanently.
Yeah, it's interesting how small conversations like that can be such a huge catalyst in somebody's lives. And it's something that I try and take into account when I'm talking with somebody that I'm working with, whether it's a kid or an adult or whatever. It's amazing how it may have just been that one conversation just completely shifted your trajectory.
Absolutely. And I felt like there were a number of those that kept happening. That was the first. Even my decision to pursue a PhD, I didn't want to, but the president at the time, Dr. Dorothy Kaiser Yancey, she wanted to nominate me for the David and Lucille Packard Fellowship Program, which would be 5 years of funding to pursue a PhD. And when she called me to nominate me over fall break, I told her, well, yeah, thank you, but I really don't want to do a PhD. I think I may want to do a master's because I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew I did not want to work. And so as a college senior, I just wasn't ready to go into the working world and get on that schedule. But she told me, I'm going to nominate you anyway. This is too good of an opportunity to turn down. So send me your resume. And worst case scenario is you get it and you say no. And so I took the chance and it worked out.
Yeah, I had similar experiences. I hadn't even considered a PhD. I was just going to get a master's, and I was taking a class and I was writing a paper on this topic, and we were only supposed to cite like 10 sources or whatever. I ended up citing like 30 or 40 sources because I was just really interested in the topic. And when I submitted the paper, the professor's like, you just basically did a chapter 2 of a dissertation on this topic. Have you thought about doing a PhD? And I was like, well, I didn't even consider it. And it's just funny how that little conversation, it just completely shifted my trajectory in terms of where I went.
Mm-hmm.
It's fun, at least for me, to reflect on like those various catalysts in life, whether positive or negatives. Like I shared with you on Twitter, like I have this Calvin tattoo of like trying to play in the rain. And like I've had moments in my life where like a car accident made it so that it was really bad in the moment, but like made me focus more on education. And it's funny how those little things completely shift best laid plans.
Absolutely. That's what I tell people. You can plan all day and then life happens and you have to go with it. It's funny because I grew up running track and it was that same thing that I had this idea that I was going to run track at a huge D1 school and all of these. And then I played basketball in the winter to avoid having to practice outdoors for indoor and tore my ACL in 11th grade. And so that totally shifted like, oh, well, there goes track. So it was one of those situations where even the types of schools that I was interested in attending totally changed, because before where I was looking at a LSU or Texas or even Carolina, like that totally shifted. And so now I'm not worried about sports, even like I just want to be somewhere where I can thrive. And so all of my schools that I applied to as an undergrad were HBCUs.
Mm-hmm.
And even people told me, some of my teachers told me, well, you need to go to a good school, Nicki. And I kept saying, well, what is a good school? And you're equating good to white. And I don't want to attend a PWI. I want to be somewhere where I can thrive and I don't have to fight every day.
Yeah. And for people who are listening and aren't familiar with it, HBCU, historically black college university, and then PWI is primarily white institution. So just in case people aren't familiar with the terminology. Now, on that topic, what I read on your website is that at some point you had realized that you're growing up as a black woman surrounded by black engineers was the exception and was not the norm. And I'm wondering how that realization has kind of impacted your trajectory in CS and CS education.
Yeah, I think I did not realize it until I arrived at Johnson C. Smith in my programming courses. And I think because growing up in Durham, it's such a unique city, especially at that time. You're surrounded by Duke, North Carolina Central, and Durham Tech. And then you've got Carolina right down the road, NC State, Shaw, and a ton of other schools as well. And it had a rich history of Black excellence in the Hayti community and Black Wall Street. So for me, it just kind of was commonplace to see representation of myself and always being told through my parents' friends, who also just happened to be the parents of my friends growing up, that the only limit is you. And whatever you start, you finish. You can be whatever, you can do whatever. But when I got to the university, I realized everyone didn't have those experiences because they're coming from different parts of the country and different backgrounds even. So they didn't have necessarily a lot of people in computing who may have been adults, or they may not have had a lot of college graduates even in their environment. But it was really important for me as I started navigating spaces, even in graduate school, that I tried to make sure that people coming behind me saw themselves in me. So as a graduate student, I would tutor at Shaw and St. Aug, myself and another Black graduate student in electrical and computer engineering. And then even as I moved into working in industry at the Aerospace Corporation, I was doing talks around graduate school and the importance of pursuing a PhD or a master's degree at Howard in the College of Engineering. And it just so happened that one of these chance encounters again, my closest friend in college is from DC, and he was teaching at the time at his alma mater. And so I went out to one of the high school football games, and his cousin, who was a faculty member, Dr. Clay Gloucester at the time in electrical and computer engineering at Howard, said, "Oh, you graduated. That's great. I hadn't seen you in a couple of years, and you want to teach a class at Howard?" And I thought, well, that would be kind of cool. Okay. And so it started as this idea of me being an adjunct professor. But at the time, a faculty member left, and they were looking to fill that spot, and they'd never had a Black woman on faculty on the tenure track side at Howard. And so the incoming chair, who was LaGann Burge, was in Clay Gloucester's ear saying, ask her if she'd be willing to apply for the full-time position. And so it kind of worked out again where I knew that there was something. I really enjoyed the opportunity to speak to students and to be in front of them and encourage them and tell them, these are the things that you need to do. Here's the blueprint for how I did it. Here's how you can too. And I thought that that would be really important for students to see, one, especially when I realized that there was never a Black woman in the department. And then when I thought back on my experience, even at an HBCU in the department, I'd never seen a Black faculty member as well. So I never saw a Black woman. I never saw a Black professor. Now, we had other Black faculty across the university because it was a Black college. But I knew that in a field like computer science, it would be important, especially for young men and women, especially at Howard of all places, to see themselves in computer science, especially to see a Black woman. So that was really the reason that pushed me into a career in academia. And I think every space I've moved in, every university since then, I've tried to make sure that I'm always doing it because there's someone who looks like me who needs to see that they belong, they're valued, and that they don't have to do it the quote traditional way that everyone tends to tell them.
Yeah, it's amazing how there's a huge lack of diversity, both in the K-12 context, like 80% of teachers are white, and then in the higher ed context as well. So like, I think all of my K-12 teachers were white. In college, I had one Black professor who I worked with all 4 years. He was a percussion person, so like I got private lessons with him for all 4 years, and it was great. And then I had a couple of professors who were Navajo, because there's a lot of Navajo in Arizona. But other than that, all white. And it's amazing how that can have an impact in terms of basically implicitly saying these are the kinds of people who get these kinds of jobs and do these kinds of things. And that lack of representation can have a huge impact without even having to say anything about it.
Absolutely.
I'm wondering if you could share the story that you shared with me about the paper that I unpacked a few weeks ago, the When Twice as Good Isn't Enough.
Yeah. So, like I said, I started my career in academia at Howard in 2006, and I left in 2015. My dad had died. And so I took a position at Winthrop for a number of reasons. I thought that it would be a great fit for me in terms of doing CS Ed, as well as bringing some initiatives to a state, because I'd done some work with DC public school system and computer science then as well. And I had a lot of challenges there over the 5 years at Winthrop that I've shared very publicly in a lot of my talks and writing. And one of the biggest challenges was moving into a space where now you're at a predominantly white institution, you're at an institution in the South Carolina at that, and having to deal with being expected to or being asked to change who you are in order to make people, particularly students, comfortable with your existence and presence.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of work around and research around how course evaluations particularly impact the trajectories of women, people of color, and those with intersecting identities, being women who are also of color.
Yep.
And that came to light a lot for me, where I was in situations where I would deal with a lot of biased student evaluations that on the qualitative feedback would talk about she's rude, she's disrespectful, she has no gratitude. And having to have conversations with leadership about these are issues of bias versus being told, oh, Nicki, students complain about everybody. And I would have to say, but they're not saying that you don't have any gratitude. They would never write these things about white men around here. And so that paper was really born out of my frustration in 2019. I applied in 2018 for promotion to full professor, which at the university, of course, it goes assistant professor, associate professor, and then full professor, which is the highest rank. So my first application for promotion was denied in the spring of 2019. I got very limited feedback at the time, and the feedback was that it was based on student evaluations that explicitly noted that, quote, students have complained that she's rude, disrespectful, and mean. Suggestion is to vary teaching strategies to account for different types of student dynamics. And I said, well, I included an entire about 5-page breakdown of all of my student evaluations and showing that for every one negative feedback, there were two positive that totally contradicted it, including one student contradicting themselves who was the same person. It didn't matter. And I was really frustrated. And, for all lack of better ways to put it, I was super pissed. And so I decided to find a way. And I think it wasn't only that, it was the conversation that followed regarding it, where I was explicitly told that we need to find a way for students to like you and for students to improve your course evaluations. I think you're a great professor, but are there people that you can talk to about how to improve your teaching? And I said, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to reach out to anybody, because this is not an issue about my teaching. This is an issue of student bias that no one here wants to acknowledge. And I told them, if you're asking me to change who I am for the sake of being liked for student evaluations, then I'll tell you, I'm not going to be here much longer. That was the spring of 2019. In talking with the new provost, I was asked to apply again in 2019, 2020, same thing happened. But I wrote that paper over the spring and summer of 2019. My thought was, this is not just happening to me. I know it's not just happening to me, because I have plenty of peers who are not only Black, they may be of other races and ethnicities, but they are experiencing the exact same issues, especially women. They're being denied promotions, they're being denied jobs even, because that follows you when you have to apply for a new job in academia. You have to submit all of your course evaluations. And the same thing was happening even in industry. So in 2018, I published the semester before Unapologetically Dope. And I'm getting emails and calls from my former students, a lot of them young women, not all, but former Howard students, who were saying, I'm having these issues, some of the same things. And so my thing was, why is this still happening?
Yep.
This was happening to my mom throughout her career. It's happening to me. It's now happening to another generation of young women. It will continue until we figure out how to stop focusing on issues of access and mentoring that people tend to think that students from marginalized groups need, and start turning that attention to the students who are from the non-marginalized groups, particularly white and Asian by race, and men by gender. And if we do that, then we'll start to fix these issues, because we keep saying we need to provide access and resources for marginalized students and faculty, but then we drop them into environments where they're still one of the few, if not the only. There's been no focus or work on the other people who don't identify as these groups. And so they just continue what they're doing, and we're all expected to just weather the storm and push through. But we can't push through. We see the numbers that are happening in Silicon Valley. We see the numbers that are happening even in higher ed. And so because of that, I started looking at what is happening in social science. And around that time, I'd already started reading a number of books that were coming out and being released, Race After Technology, Algorithms of Oppression. And then I started to look, well, what are other places or fields doing that have to work with diverse groups of people? So I looked first at education and healthcare, and then they all led back to social work and this idea of cultural competence. And honestly, cultural competence was a term I'd never really remembered hearing in all of my education, my 9 years between undergrad to grad school, and it definitely wasn't discussed at any point along the way in my career. We've done a lot of work in culturally responsive pedagogy or curriculums and cultural relevance, but nothing about cultural competence. So as I started to study it more and read about it, I kept saying, why in the world are we not doing this in computer science? This is the problem, is that these other disciplines are making sure that every graduate comes out and they are able to engage with people from different identities and cultures in ways that ensure that the goal is met, but that they are also respecting and understanding the differences that they share, and being able to facilitate communication in a way that does not make that vulnerable population feel less than or minimized. So why have we not done that here? So that was really what it was born out of. It was really my protest, my frustration, and my ability to say, well, if this is what you're going to do, then okay, then this is I'll show you. And I'm just going to take this bad batch of whatever it is I was given and turn it into something that's a win for me.
Yeah, I don't remember if this made the conversation or the cut for the podcast, but when I interviewed Joyce McCall, she's a assistant professor in Chicago, and I've known her for several years, and she mentioned all the same things that you were mentioning in terms of people just don't get it, what it's like. But she's fortunate in that she has Adrienne Dixon as like a mentor in the College of Education who has been there, done that, gotten tenure, and like can help her navigate it and whatnot. So it's very difficult when you are the only person in your institution or in your department and not have people to talk to about some of these issues. And for people who are interested in it, look up scholarship on discourse analysis and the way that people talk about different races or use different words in different contexts. Like the word urban in some context is associated with black, with poor, with like all these like negative connotations, the way that people are phrasing them. And then when they talk about suburban or rural, then they're talking about it completely differently. So it's a rabbit hole that I recommend listeners go down. But I'm curious with your experiences with this and with your research interests and whatnot on like measuring and improving like historically disenfranchised groups, like what have you learned through this process that people can do to try and help prevent some of this from happening?
I think there are a few things. The first thing is to realize that everyone operates in a space of privilege. The thing that I think 2020 is showing all of us is just how problematic we all are in certain ways, especially when we are called on ourselves or our issues are presented to us. It's very hard for people to talk about race. I've seen that firsthand. Now, it's usually people who are in non-marginalized positions. So honestly, that tends to be white folks for the better part, where it becomes a very uncomfortable conversation. And it's, it's a lot of defensiveness, but not recognizing that people like me have had to always talk about being Black because we just don't have a choice. People who identify as Asian may have to do the same, right? People who identify as Native also may have to do the same because otherwise our voices and our experiences will never be heard and respected. And I think it's important to recognize that you have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. There's a lot of desire to kind of get things over with quick and fast so we can move on. And that's how we got to where we are in 2020, not just in society, but also in the state of computing. And we saw that with the Black and the Ivory Twitter hashtag and shut down STEM and even the most recent scholar strike, right? There are all of these things that have been happening because nobody wanted to talk about it. The second thing is to decenter yourselves. So I think that there's a lot of attempts, even in this CS education space, a lot of the people who have been doing the work, who have been the most prevalent, who have been the most prominent and received the most attention are, again, white men and women. And the voices of the people who identify the same as the students tend to be the voices that are marginalized. They don't get the exposure. They don't get the opportunities and the access to a lot of these opportunities, events, conferences, keynotes, et cetera. So it's not even about making space for individuals from different identities. It's about giving up your space altogether. Because a lot of times people say, I'm going to make space, but I'm just going to make just enough over here to let you sneak in, but I'm still going to take over majority of it. And that doesn't serve any of us any good. And I think also to stop operating from this deficit mindset of students from marginalized groups. I remember vividly sitting, it was either a conference or some workshop, and someone got up and said, yeah, we're doing stuff at my university for Black kids and for rich kids. And I just paused like, excuse me? What did I just hear? And it's this, like you said, the discourse analysis and the words that are used to describe certain demographics of students. How do you parallel Black with rich? And things that when people say, for example, you reference things as people of color, but you're really talking about Black people because you feel unsure about saying it. I want you to call it out because I am not like every other person of color. We're not a monolith. Even Black people are not a monolith. But if you're talking about Black people, say it. You know, one of the great things, and I shout out Dr. Tiffany Williams, because the article she wrote for Communications of ACM earlier this summer about calling people from systemically marginalized groups underrepresented minorities and the racism that's rooted in that. It's so true because we see it, but we've all used that language because that's what we were taught. It was so ingrained in the terminology we saw every single day. And even in my class, I talk to students about the fact that every time you see anything around diversity or inclusion, what is the language in terms of the target demographics? And they'll say women, underrepresented groups, and then something else. Well, what if I'm a Black woman? Where do I fall into this spectrum when you're identifying and listing all of these people? So there's no understanding even of intersectionality and how that plays an important piece. So I'd say everybody needs to start thinking about those three things, but also start to learn from the social sciences and the humanities and understand critical race theory. I think it's, absolutely absurd and disgusting to hear the rhetoric coming out at the federal level from the highest person in office right now about the divisiveness of critical race theory. And it's just feeding this narrative that nothing is a problem here when we see every single day that it is for people who don't operate from a cisgender, white, heterosexual, male identity.
Yeah, learning more about critical race theory and like the other sub points within that, like double consciousness. Like when you were talking earlier in that discussion, I was just like, oh yeah, that makes me think of that conversation with Joyce where we unpacked what is double consciousness in terms of like when Joyce is in a group, she also has to think of herself as Black and view the perspective of a white person viewing her as Black, and like having those two different perspectives going on simultaneously. Like it's mentally draining having to consciously be aware of that all the time. And it's something that I, as a white individual, don't have to think about and haven't had to worry about.
Absolutely.
I'm curious, when you've engaged with this kind of research and learning from like social work and things like that, were there any surprises along the way that you were just hadn't anticipated?
The biggest surprise for me was that this wasn't being done anywhere that I could find, right? For a while gave me a lot of pause, and I spent a lot of time just digging and digging, which is why that 60 position paper had so many references, because I kept going through a number of papers and avenues and looking and saying, surely someone has been talking about this at an in-depth level in terms of what needs to be taught in computing departments. The first paper I'd seen outside of that was discussing anything around these topics was paper that just won Sig Chai's Best Paper Award that was looking at HCI and critical race theory and HCI by a group of Black women authors. And I think the overwhelming majority of them are grad students even. But aside from that, it shocked me. And it shocked me so much because as I read Algorithms of Oppression and Race After Technology, everything that they're talking about, it's just, I'm like, they're discussing everything we do in this field and everything we teach our students. So why are we not even teaching this? And the more I started to take little bits and plug it into, for example, I've always been on the front end of the undergraduate experience. So I would teach the intro to programming or data structure, something around that. I would ask my students, have you ever thought about how different algorithms affect people differently? And they were floored when I would tell them that facial recognition technology doesn't recognize darker skin tones. They'd never even thought about that, especially for students in South Carolina to start understanding that and start looking and being hungry for more information was really impactful. But it was also disheartening because it says, what are we not doing and how are we failing students across the board and across the country?
Yeah, this is a topic that should be in CS education programs, but it's not. Like you mentioned with the facial recognition technology, I read a paper that like early uses of facial recognition technology, the percentages of success rates were flipped between a light and a dark skinned. So it was like 90% success with a white person, and then with a Black person was like 90% failure rate. And so I did a presentation recently on engineered inequalities, and one of the things that I gave as an example is a video showing a white person putting their hand under a soap dispenser, and then a Black person does the same thing. It won't dispense the soap. So like whether it's in the algorithm or in the physical devices that we're creating, like these are things that we need to talk about, and we're not, which is why I was glad to see it in your paper. But it's also like, well, why did that just come out in 2020? Why haven't we been talking about this for decades?
Yeah, there are Black women, even in the computing space, who have been doing this research around bias and artificial intelligence. So Joy Bulamwini, Timnit Gebru, Ridi Ababa, and Deb Rajni. But they are in the AI space. And so if you're not moving into that space of research, then they don't get the exposure to the introduction to programming students the way they should. Every student in computing should know those four women's names because they are so critical in everything that's been happening, not just over the last few months with a lot of technologies being sunset by places like Amazon and IBM, but also just over the last few years because of the work they've been doing in this space and the pushback that they received. But I think that it was bothersome because it also spoke to nobody's willing to dig deeper, right? Even when I had the idea for this class at first, I pitched it and I got the idea, well, we already have an ethics course. So how is this different? And I just kept saying, well, a medical doctor can be ethical and still lack bedside manner.
Right.
It's not about ethics. It's about all of these other things that you all purport to really support and really want to encourage and foster these inclusive environments. But is it really what you want, or is it just lip service because it's checking a box and it sounds good? If I have to sit here and argue with you about cultural competence does not equal ethics, then that says to me there's already a bigger problem and that you lack one of these for sure.
Yeah, and then on the other end of the spectrum, if you get a course like that where you are talking about these things, that now needs to bleed out into all of the other courses. So if you're doing an assignment, like one of the things that a professor did that I really liked was for education majors, they would randomly assign this fake IEP that a student had to prepare for. So you're going to create a lesson and you have to think, okay, at least one of your kids is on the autism spectrum, or at least one of the kids only has one arm, or et cetera, et cetera. So like just different things to consider when designing lesson plans and whatnot. And I think something like that can easily be incorporated into an assignment. Like, okay, you're all assigned into these different groups. Your software or hardware needs to take into account these different design considerations and whatnot. So it's an easy way to actually apply the understandings outside of the class.
Right. And it's easy to dump even culturally competent modules into every single current computing course without creating a course, right? And that's what was so flooring. Like, how is this not being done? How are people just so unwilling to even see? And the more that things have happened over 2020, I'm not sure if I still believe it's a lack of willingness. I think there was a lot of that in place. But I think that for the other subset of people, it was a lack of knowledge and understanding and wanting to learn, but not having the requisite skill set to teach it.
Do you have any recommendations for either K-12 or higher ed CS educators about how to improve diversity, equity, inclusion?
I would say, like I tell people all the time on Twitter, listen to Black women and believe them. We tend to be those canaries in the coal mine, and people always listen to us a little too late. I would say also taking away the idea of focusing on numbers, right? There's so much emphasis on we want to get X number of students from this demographic, and we want to make sure that we have X number of women, X number of Black, Latina, Native. That's not representative of a good measurement because you can get numbers, but how many people are you going to keep? And there's a difference between getting them in the door and keeping them there. And people don't understand or appreciate the importance of being seen. I say that all the time. Like, I want you to not just recognize that I'm here, but see my experiences and understand that I move in spaces differently than other people. I have to, like you said, with double consciousness, I operate always thinking about a white gaze, sometimes more than others, but I need you to understand that that's a reality for your students. And also recognizing that your students come with a lot of different experiences right now. COVID is showing that a lot of times, and it's heartbreaking to hear some of the stories, like the young kid who just got suspended for having a Nerf gun in his Zoom background and the teacher called the cops. It's those kinds of issues that are flooring when you think about people right now, educators especially, tout this idea of diversity and inclusion and equity. But then when something like that happens, they're quick to do exactly what they've always done, which is pick up a phone and call the police instead of trying to stop for a minute and process and recognizing that diversity does not mean you have an inclusive or an equitable environment. It just means that you've dumped a bunch of different people from different identities into one pool. It does not mean that it's an inclusive environment, that it's not a toxic environment, or that they came there from equitable situations, or you've made it equitable. Get away from diversity. I tell everyone, stop using that word. Just focus on creating inclusive and equitable environments. If you do that, the diversity will automatically come, because it's something like I heard before where, diversity is being invited to the party, but inclusion is being asked to dance and actually take up space. Until we do that, we're kind of just all chasing windmills.
Yeah, I like that. And I think your points, especially about the questions that are being asked in terms of like the numbers that people focus on with the demographics. Like, so I myself identify as non-binary, and that is not in most demographics. Like, it's not even an option to check. It's either male or female, and sometimes there's an other option. The kinds of questions that you're asking and the numbers that you're collecting aren't representative of it. But then we actually go, like you mentioned earlier, with intersectionality. It's not just the fact that I have these identities that are labeled as silos. Like, it's how they interact with each other and whatnot that for me is extremely important as an individual.
And I think it's really important, especially for K-12 educators, even more so, to start looking at some of these authors, some of these social scientists, humanities people who have written some amazing work around this space, right? And I use myself as an example because one of the earlier assessments that I was working on, I used under the gender category, male, female, other. And I talk about that all the time because I say, when I look at it now, I cringe because it was something I didn't even think about, but I was moving in a space of privilege again, thinking about how someone who does not identify as male or female would feel by having to check other, and that othering that you create when you're trying to assess things or just engage with people. So you have to learn to be very intentional about every single piece and recognize that, again, we all move in spaces of privilege. When people ask me, what can I read even? I tell them, start with something like Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde, she's amazing in her writing about all of the facets of her identity of being a Black queer woman and having to deal with these issues of age, race, class, gender, and sexuality, and how they all overlap and intersect, and how pivotal they all are to who she is and her experiences navigating in the world. I think it would give so many educators a better understanding of all of the layers that their students bring to the table when they show up, either in Zoom or if it's back in the classroom or anywhere else. And not only that, like I said, people don't understand enough how the experiences of their students who have certain identities are identical to their colleagues. If your students are having issues, then your colleagues are as well. The difference is that your colleagues probably are not going to share it as much because there's issues, like you said before, promotion, hiring, just concerns about bias and discrimination from a number of different angles, be it based on race, sexuality, gender. But being able to understand, put yourself in the perspective of someone else and understand fully, how would you want to be seen? And how would you want others to see you? And then move in that way that you are always making sure that whoever's in front of you, even if they're not in front of you, they are still seen in the conversations, in the work you do, because they know that in the back of your mind, you're always thinking about outside of yourself. That's really hard for people to do, but you have to be very intentional about it.
Like, thinking of that broader perspective outside of what you're doing, I'm wondering, what are some things that you've learned, broadly speaking, from your experiences? Like you said, you've worked with DC Public Schools. You also helped write the K-12 CS standards for South Carolina. You were also one of the lead writers for the K-12 CS framework. So, like, thinking about those broad things, like the frameworks and the standards, how those impact people, what have you learned from those experiences?
I think the biggest things I learned were in the development process and the convening of people from all of these different backgrounds. So it wasn't just, for example, faculty, K-12 educators. There were people who were nonprofits or in the government sector. And then there were all of these other people who may have been just part of feedback or contributing in other ways outside of writing. The biggest thing I learned is that not everybody in CS education gets it, right? Everybody thinks they do, but they don't. And that was very telling because some of the conversations, became some of those good intentions that just are terrible ideas. I think the other piece was recognizing that there is such a difference in the experience of a student, not just based on their identities, but based on where they are geographically across the country. So, I spent 10 years in DC, 9 of those years at Howard. And while DC is a diverse city, DC still runs the spectrum in terms of class and income levels. And so we actually, for a full academic year, myself, my department chair, Lee Burge, and 4 students taught a full computer science course at the middle school that Howard has on campus, the Middle School of Math and Science. And because it was a charter school, they came from all across DC, but they were all Black and Latinx students, the entire 300 student population. But you got to see all of these students from different backgrounds, and all of the students had access to technology, and they had access through the school itself. As part of being at that school, you had access to technology at the school, but then you also got a laptop at home. When I relocate, and now I'm working on the K-12 standards in South Carolina, there were a lot of conversations from K-12 educators and district leaders that were saying, these standards we're developing are great, but we still struggle with a lot of students with basic digital literacy. And so, in addition to creating the standards, we also had to create a K-8 digital literacy standards to ensure that students had proper access and understanding of just how to use technology before we could start to get into the computer science aspects. And then there were the issues, again, of access, because depending on where you are, does your school district even have enough computers to serve as a lab for a classroom in order to roll this out, right? There was the goal of that these standards are across the state, and every school will have to teach these courses. But how does that look in a school that's severely underfunded right now? So I think that was the biggest eye-opening experience for me, is that these standards that are developed, they're great, but there's still a lot of work to be done just to be able to even implement them properly. And that's still a lot of work. Even now that, COVID exacerbated that and brought it to light. But even still, there are issues with that. There's students who have to go to a McDonald's or somewhere, a public resource, or sit in their car in order to have school all day.
Yeah, and the issues of like, well, what kinds of devices do teachers and students have access to? Like, what you can do with an iPad is different from a Chromebook, which is different from a laptop or a desktop. And then do you have access to it at home? Cool. If you have access to it at home, do you actually have internet? Okay, if you have internet, how many people are using it at the same time? So like larger families, it's a lot harder for them to all be on a Zoom call at the same time, et cetera, et cetera. It's such a huge problem, and it's something that has certainly been exacerbated with COVID. You had mentioned that like not everyone gets it. One of the questions that I like to think through for myself is, what do I not get right now that I'm going to look back on like 5 years from now and go, wow, I'm doing that completely differently now, and I'm glad I am. And one of the things I like to think about is like in my teaching, when I first started teaching, I used to think X, but now I think Y. And what has changed? So I'm curious, do you have any examples of like, when I first started teaching, I used to think this, but now I think something completely different?
So, full disclaimer, when I started teaching, I was 28. It was my very first time teaching ever. I didn't have any experience with office hours, anything. I think my advisor asked me to proctor an exam one time, and that was it. So for me, it was totally fish out of water context. Luckily, my dad's a K-12 educator turned administrator, so he kind of coached me through a lot of things. I think I entered the university making sure I operated in a space of what worked for me in terms of how did I best receive information. And not only that, I think I operated also in a space of making sure, because I was so young and I looked so much like the students, that I was trying to make sure there was a line of delineation where I'm not a peer, I'm a professor. And I think I needed that. But I think I also started to realize that how I didn't need certain things in learning, not only because of my exposure to the concepts at the time, but I think also because I'd had so much opportunity over my younger years to participate in things that were focused around critical thinking and logic. So a lot of things I just took for granted. And the more that I progressed, I realized that I need to make this make sense as much as possible to any student who's coming in with zero knowledge. And let me make the assumption that a student's coming in, because of course, in those intro courses for computing majors, we're all told, you should, if you don't have any experience in programming, then you should at least have already taken calculus or be taking calculus. Where there's going to be a lot of students that I learned, especially in my first early years, that have not taken calculus. They may show up and they may be taking pre-cal at the university. So calculus is going to be maybe the next semester or the next year down the road. But that doesn't mean that, again, they're operating in a deficit. It just means that whatever their trajectory was, it didn't get them the calculus before they graduated. So you don't need calculus to be a critical thinker or to have computational thinking. So for me, it was always about, how do I make this make sense in a way that any student could grasp this without feeling like I'm slowing the class down for those who may be a little bit more ahead, but also that I'm not moving too fast for those who may not be following this as easy. And I also started to learn ways to help other students who may be struggling navigate and figure out what they're doing wrong. So for me, it was always, well, you just got to practice. I was an athlete. And so for me, it was always, if you practice, you're training your mind, your mind's a muscle. So, just keep doing it. And that would work for me a lot of times in grad school. I would just drill something in my head and look at it until it just clicked and it made sense. Everyone doesn't operate in that space. And so I had to learn how to bring it home to students in ways that were extremely visual, especially in a programming class. And that's hard to do when you're trying to teach basic concepts and you've never taught before. But it helped me learn how to make things make sense without having to be in front of a computer and not having a compiler and everything. I took it and applied it to all of my lessons, where I tell students, start with a picture. If I give you a problem, draw it. I don't want to see any code. Just draw it out in a way that makes it make sense and start building it from there. And I think that that's helped a lot for me. It's helped a lot for students, because then they stop and they don't think about, let me sit down and start typing something. And one of the other things I would start to do is, I learned how to glean certain pieces of information that were actual constructive criticism from course evaluations. I tell a lot of people, especially junior faculty, don't take course evals to heart, because you've got the subset of students who did well and they don't care. They're not going to submit an evaluation because they're done. But there's also a subset who are mad at you about something and they're going to use that to lash out. So don't look at that. Don't look at rate my professor, nothing. Every now and then there's something that makes sense, like, oh, I wish you'd slowed down or just focused a little bit in on this. And that was helpful. So what I would start to do even now is check in with students. And it was really important over the last several semesters, and even with COVID, because it became a thing of, my dad would tell me this all the time, is that the students don't care what you know till they know you care, right? And I would just tell them, like, look, when COVID hit in March, I was already struggling. Mentally, I was just over everything and everybody anyway. But when that hit, I just shut down. And so I emailed my students and I said, look, we are going to figure out how to get through this together. I am overwhelmed. I'm sure you all are. So we're going to do what we need to do to get through this. And the students, I found, were so appreciative of that. And I changed all of the assignments to make sure that it wasn't overburdening them. It wasn't monotonous. It wasn't something that was just, checking a box to make sure we covered X, Y, and Z. And it gave me an opportunity to learn about them. I learned that, some of these students were picking up jobs to try to make sure they help their family for someone who lost income, or, they're back home and they're overwhelmed because they have a younger sibling that they're now trying to help get through the school day because their parents are working and they're trying to navigate their learning plus their younger sibling. So just having that ability to extend the humanity part of it. And again, I think that that's not what we're taught in computer science. We're taught, nobody cares about your feelings. This is what it is. We operate in facts, but you have to move in this space of feelings and humanity, because life happens. And if we don't, again, we continue to see these same situations. And these are students who you could quickly lose because they start to feel further marginalized.
Yep.
Right? It's not like, oh, I'm falling behind. My professor knows this and she's telling me, look, let's figure out a schedule. How can you get this in? How can we make this work? Or, she's making it so that it's asynchronous, so that I don't have to worry about sitting in front of a computer exactly the same time that my sibling is.
Yeah, I like that. I like the idea of like the multi-perspectival approach to teaching, thinking of different ways to teach things and then to approach it from a point of compassion. I'm curious, how do you do that in larger class sizes? So like in the elementary space, my class sizes were up to 35 kids, which that's manageable. But I saw a few hundred a week because I had several different classes and whatnot. So whether it's that kind of a context or you're teaching like a lecture with like 300 people, how do you include all these different perspectives and like try and be compassionate with students?
So it's funny you asked that because that was the question that was asked during my interview at Duke. and it was like, yeah, what's your biggest class size? And I said, oh, it's about 40 or 50. And they're like, yeah, our largest is about 400. It's interesting because I think you have to assemble a great team, right? And I'm going to say it in two spaces. The first is where you have the ability to assemble a team of other people who can assist, right? So TAs, teaching assistants, any other graders, whatever it is, understanding that that team is operating from that same mindset. Like we all understand that this can be a lot for us. So we need to remember it's a lot for the students. We need to move accordingly. We need to make sure that we are attentive to any flags or things that may be concerning about a certain set of students or one or two students. But if you're in a space where you don't have the resources of a TA or any assistance, I found that the ability to just collect the information a lot of times is helpful. Even if it's a simple Google form or a Qualtrics form, and it just asks an open-ended question, how are you doing? Just somebody asking how you're doing, and then students can submit, and then you can review it and start to itemize, like, who needs more attention right now? Who's going through something right now that I need to pay attention to or flag? For me, it became overwhelming even when my classes were about 30 or 40, because I may have been teaching, like you said, over the course of like 150 students across 4 classes, and it's just me. And so the easiest way for me a lot of times was just to create those forms and let students dump. And it may be, every so often, like I just throw it out there every month or every couple of weeks, like what's going on. That's going to be critical, especially as we move forward post 2020, because we have to rethink how we do everything and how we engage with students. I think that we have to rethink not just how we engage with them, but how we teach them, and how we engage with them should influence and impact how we teach them. It's easy when you're in front of a classroom and you're on a board and you're writing something and you turn around, okay, any questions, any comments, any concerns? You'll get one or two and then boom, you're back to what you're doing. But now in the age of Zoom, it doesn't work the same. And there's so many other things that are going on in a student's mind and even in their background, right? We still have arguments about why people are forcing students to turn on their videos. No matter what the course size is, I think you just have to take the time to be intentional. And there are ways to do that can make it as least stressful as possible and strenuous as possible for you, which is why I say a lot of times that's where the beauty of technology comes into place, because you can automate that, send it out, but then you can filter that information pretty quickly and start to review that and look at how can I reach those students who need me the most, but then still also let every other student know, hey, I see you.
Yeah, and speaking of like the making it as least stressful for you, I'm curious because education and like being a professor, like there's a high burnout rate. Like the job never ends. There's always something else to learn or to do. And I'm wondering, how do you personally nurture your mind, body, spirit?
Good question. I have actually thought about this summer. I think this was the first summer that I had zero time to decompress. So I'd never in 15 years of teaching ever done summer school or anything. So my summer was always my time to kind of just do whatever for 3 months. And then everything with COVID, packing, moving, transitioning to a new job and creating a new course. And so I am kind of 5 minutes and maybe one more class lecture away from a full meltdown. But I say for me, exercise. So I walk. Unfortunately, I can't run anymore due to knee injuries, but I try to walk, not as much as I should. So I have to get back on a routine, but that's always very helpful for me. Music is a huge source of zen for me. I love music, and honestly, TV. I'm a huge TV junkie. So TV shows and music and podcasts are kind of getting me through all of this, especially TV and music more so than anything. So anyone who sees me on Twitter, I'm always tweeting about whatever I'm watching, whatever I'm listening to. That gives me life right now. I have to definitely appreciate things like the Versus series that started over COVID, because it gives me a chance to just remember when and be nostalgic about music that I enjoy. TV shows, like right now I'm watching Lovecraft Country and I'm so caught up in that. And then even, before Watchmen, or I watch a lot of old shows too. So I'm either alternating between Martin, King of Queens, and Golden Girls. And then during the day, I wake up and it's Living Single, Girlfriends, and In the Heat of the Night. I'm all over the place. And I tell people I'm high key using Twitter kind of as my own therapy right now. So, I may be talking about something real serious at 1:00, but by 9:00, I'm talking about something on TV or something that's popping up. And it's hard because I feel like I'm an extroverted introvert. So I like to be by myself, but at the same time, I like to do it on my terms. So for me, being an only child, I could be very comfortable being home. So the first couple of months or first couple of weeks in March, it was great. I'm like, that's just another weekend for me. But then by April 1st, it was okay. I've had enough of this. I need to see people and engage. And, here it is. It's September and we're still not outside yet. So I've had to really find ways to step away from technology and just veg out. And for me, that's just been exercise, music, TV, because there's really not much else you can do yet, or we should be doing. I mean, there's a lot that some people are doing, but yeah, I'm home.
Are you listening to music, or are you also creating the music?
Well, no, I'm not creating music. I'm just a karaoke performer. I'm not an actual singer. Yeah, I'd say listening to music, that's it. And then shower singing.
Yeah, my wife and I are both percussionists, and there's something about just like hitting a drum that's also very relaxing. It's therapeutic to just like go put on some music. I have this like funk playlist that I listen to, and I'll just go on drum set and just like jam out, and I just like come away from that just feeling so relaxed and whatnot. It's just, I don't know, it's nice. So if you have the opportunity, I recommend making the music as well, but listening to it's also wonderful.
I don't think my mom would appreciate a drum set right now until I got my own place, but yeah.
Yes, good point. My parents, speaking from like a point of privilege, one of the privileges that I have had is my parents put up with the fact that I'd make music for several hours a day, every day of the week. And the fact that like it was percussion. So I'd be banging a drum in my room or playing a marimba, and several hours a day. The fact that they didn't kick me out of the house for that.
Oh my gosh, yeah, I can imagine. I used to play piano when I was younger. I stopped after about 3 years. But my parents, it would be the same thing. I'd just kind of be banging away. And sometimes I do miss it because it was good therapy, like you said, just to sit there and be able to just tap something or do something.
I'm curious, what do you wish there was more research on that could inform like your practices or inform the field as a whole?
I don't even know if this is feasible, but I think that more research around something related to faculty, specifically faculty beliefs, faculty engagement in certain activity. I think something outside of just the quantitative, how many students who identify as X have you mentored? But actually getting to the root of some things around, why are you in academia? Why are you in computing in academia? What has shaped your experiences and your beliefs to date? And that's something that I don't think a lot of faculty would necessarily be honest about unless it was highly anonymous. But I think that it would start to give better clarity and context to some of the issues that we see in higher education. Being able to ask those questions that are not directly related to things around race or sexuality or religious affiliation, but things that if they're asked the right way, you could glean that information and extract it in a way that you could now start to see the why and start to better understand how to engage those specific faculty, right? I want to believe, and I'm a cautious optimistic, I want to believe that most faculty want every student to succeed in their class. I don't believe that that's the case though. And I think that if we could start to get to the why that is, then we could start to fix a lot of the issues that are happening for our students.
Yeah, I know of some instances, especially in some of the quote harder sciences, there are a lot of professors who are there for the research and they begrudgingly are teaching classes to undergrads or graduate students. And so they put very little effort into that. And I'm grateful when universities have like professors of practice who focus specifically on teaching and teaching very well and not just doing the research and teaching on the side kind of a thing. But it's tricky because like you have these universities where you're paying a lot of money to learn from somebody who's really good at what they do, but they don't necessarily want to teach those courses
at all, and don't necessarily want to teach every kind of student. Like I said before, you have to come in exactly how they were as a college student, and that's all they see. And they don't know how to separate their experience at whatever age they are now, because a lot of them are over the age of 50, to Gen Zs and millennials who are growing up in a world where they never didn't know a Google, or they never didn't have a smartphone. There's all of these dynamics that are at play that have nothing to do with race or gender, but it's age even, and just desire. I don't know if that's a problem that can ever be solved. I wish it was. There's a lot of research I see that talks to students and, looks to interview students in STEM around these things, but I just don't know how many faculty would be willing to participate in something like that.
I agree with you. I think it would need to be heavily anonymized in order to actually get at the root of the thoughts behind that. What about like flipping the question onto your own research? What do you wish people understood about your own research or writing?
The biggest thing is that it holds just as much value as anything someone would consider theoretical research. It's really frustrating in this field, and it's not just over this last year, but I'd say leading up to probably George Floyd's murder, that there was an inability for the greater computing community to recognize and truly appreciate CS education-based research, or research that is not quantitative. And I'd say even in the CS education space, that was the case, because when I submitted that 60 paper, it was a position paper. And I remember when I got the reviews, there were actually one reviewer who was very much like, I don't see why this is even here. There's no data that's been collected. You need to collect this data, get feedback, and then submit it. And this may be more viable. And I said, and you're the exact reason why I wrote this paper. It's a position paper. Like, otherwise it would have been a research. It's just, but that again speaks to how problematic that not even just the greater computing community is, but just CS education. There's this issue of, if you're doing this kind of work, then it's less than, or it's not as rigorous, and it's not as valuable. And then I tell people, well, it's really interesting because 2020 hits, COVID hits, and then after George Floyd's death and the Black Lives Matter protests sparked up, all of a sudden, all of these things that I've been talking about, that my colleagues who look like me or who are from other systemically marginalized groups have been talking about, all of a sudden, all the work we're doing is the bee's knees. So why did it take all of this for you to see value in what we're doing? Why did it have to be such an explosive event and such a tragic event for you to find value in this? And then my biggest issue is, what happens January 1, 2021? So it's a new year and everyone's like, all right, we made it through 2020. And then, yep, wiping my hands. We're good. We addressed racism again. We're back to business as usual. Well, we've seen this before, right? This isn't new. Like, we didn't live through the civil rights movement, but my parents did, my grandparents did it, and so on. And so the same thing happened there, where people felt like, okay, well, the Civil Rights Act was passed, the Voting Rights Act passed. Okay, we're good. Racism's over. We elected Obama. Here we are.
Yeah, it'll be interesting, especially what happens in early November.
It frustrates me because I felt like it shouldn't have taken all of this to value the work that we do. And it's sad. It's not even sad, it's pathetic, because I feel like it just speaks to the amount of lip service in so many ways, and you see people who are in computing who are doing this work, and this is what they solely focus on. Then it becomes like, oh, great, here's somebody coming to talk to us about diversity again. Like, oh, like this is really the problem, right? And it's annoying to me because I have to tell people, well, don't get it twisted. I have 3 degrees in computer science. I am very skilled at what I do. My thesis was built around optical network survivability. So I can do queuing theory, programming, whatever you want to talk about, but I choose not to because it doesn't make a hill of beans to me. That research doesn't matter to me. And honestly, it never did. If I'm being, I've shared that before with others. Like, I did the research that my advisor was doing because I wanted to work with my advisor, and I really value the fact that he valued me. I could care less about that. But what I care about are the things that I'm working on, and I should not be forced to pivot what I'm doing to be accepted by the greater computing community.
Yeah, I like that. There was a quote of a professor that I know who was at a qualitative research conference and was given the opening keynote, and it was like, thank you so much for having me. I hope this is the last qualitative research conference we ever have. And the reason why is because I think we should be asking questions and finding a method that answers those questions. We should not be focusing on the design itself that's being used and kind of like siloing those things out. And so the fact that quantitative is seen as like this end all be all, it's like, well, no, you can only answer certain types of questions with quantitative, and you need other methods to answer different questions. So we need to be looking at this again from a multi-perspectival approach and asking many different types of questions. But the fact that we aren't doing that, it's problematic.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it continues to drive the issues that we see because everyone focuses on the numbers. That's it. Nothing else makes sense. And if we can check the box and say, well, we've got X percentage, then problem solved.
I'm curious if your answer will kind of build off of that, but do you have any questions for myself or to the field?
I think the biggest question I'd ask is for anyone, what are you going to do now that you know? Right? Now that you know, because there's a lot of people who before said, oh, I didn't know. I didn't realize it was this bad, be it society or be it in computing. I don't understand how anyone could not know in computing, but even in society, now that you've seen the Black and the Ivory hashtag, so it just wasn't that one Black student or faculty member or postdoc that was there. Now that you all participated in Shut Down STEM, what are you going to do with that? How are you going to translate that into a lifetime career commitment to creating a better space and a better environment for everyone? I don't think that's something that I would expect anyone to answer quickly, but I would expect people to be able to marinate on that and think, right? It's got to go past book clubs because everybody's reading right now.
Right.
But then you got to do something with that. So what are you willing to do? And more so, I'd ask, how much skin are you willing to put in the game? What are you willing to sacrifice in order to make sure that it's met and the goal is reached?
That really resonates with me, and I think it's a great answer even to the next question I have, which is like, what could I do to better serve the CS education community through this podcast?
Keep asking the hard questions, bringing on the people who are going to make listeners uncomfortable. And it doesn't have to be someone who's always, in the space that I'm working in, but there are other people who are doing work that infuses this, right? You had Shuchi on earlier. She does a lot of that. Kristen's doing it, just making sure that there's a good representation of men, women, and non-binary people who are in this space, who are willing to get on the mic and say, this is who I am, and this is what I'm doing, and this is why it matters. And I would especially say, get people who are willing to come on and say, I don't fit the traditional narrative.
Yeah, I like that.
Right? Because again, we operate in a black, white, male, female, anything else, rich, poor, that's it, right? Everything in our world is binary, but having people who get on the mic and talk about the fact that I do not operate or identify as a cisgender, heterosexual white man, right? I'm transgender, I'm non-binary, I may have a religious identity that other people don't necessarily understand, but I want to talk about that as well. And showing the human part of the computer scientists and the educators and letting people see that there are all of these different identities working in this space. And we have to be able to bring our fullest selves every single day. I should not have to code switch. I should not have to try to assimilate. I should not have to try to pass as something and someone I am not in order to be accepted and in order for my work to be valued.
Yeah, I love that.
I think about it and I say, how many transgender computer scientists do we learn about every day or hear about? How many people are willing to speak to these things? Because if I got up here and I never talked about my sexuality or my identity as a cisgender heterosexual Black woman, then all you would know is I was a Black woman, right? But I think it's important that everyone should be able to hear different perspectives. Everyone should hear about other individuals who share different identities and the amazing work they're doing and what you can glean and learn from them and their experiences, and not just their work, but their experience.
Yeah, and one of the things that I've kind of noticed in different marginalized groups is allies who are helping don't take control of that narrative. So, like, I'm writing a paper on transness for music educators to consider with their students. So, I'm an author. There's another author who's a trans woman, a trans man, and a non-conforming person who's also on it. So, like, we're all coming at this from different perspectives within like the trans community and talking about it. And one of the things that we're bringing up is there are not enough people who identify within the community who are actually speaking about this, and that needs to happen. So the narrative has largely been controlled by cis individuals, which is great to have the allies, but they shouldn't be in control of the narrative. And some of that is coming into like the Black Lives Matter protest, where it's like, I support Black Lives Matter, but I am not going out there and trying to change the narrative and trying to make it about me as a white individual. And some of that is happening in some of the protests, which is then taking away the power from Black individuals and creating a problem.
Absolutely. And I'd say even, these are things that people, again, have to become comfortable having those uncomfortable conversations. And you have to be okay getting it wrong and apologizing for it, learning from it, and moving forward. I think there's always this fear of being wrong or offending instead of recognizing that it's okay to make a mistake, but it's not okay to not learn from it and grow from it, which is why I talk all the time about, that assessment and my gender labelings. It was terrible to think about how someone who identified as non-conforming may see that and realize she's othering me. And how could she do that as a Black woman? But it was an honest mistake. It was something that I had to learn from and accept and realize that I don't need to change what's out there because I need people to see the change in the work that I do and how I've progressed and become better because of it. And that's the only way that everyone in this community will start to improve. And then, like I said, everyone else will feel like they matter. And I can't resonate enough why it matters to be seen. And like you said, for people to get out of the way, right? If that's not your voice and I can't speak to this identity, then it's not my responsibility to. I remember there was a question at a talk I recently gave, and someone asked me about, well, how do I navigate spaces as a biracial person? And I said, well, I can't tell you that because I'm not biracial, but I can point you to some resources and experts who are doing this work. But it's not for me to say that, right? It's for me as an advocate, an ally, whatever that is, or activist, to be able to say, I can help bring you to the things that you need, even if I can't give it to you or do it for you myself. But I'm not going to go out here and try to start speaking for you because I can't.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, finding ways to support without taking control of that and whatnot, and not answering for other people. It's definitely important. So the last question is, where might people go to connect with you and the organizations that you work with?
So there are a few ways. My personal website is just my name, NickiWashington.com, NICKI. The work that I'm working on right now around identity and computing, our website is identity@cs.duke.edu. That has information on the other members of the research team, some of the work we're doing right now, the 3C assessment that I'm working on that I noted in the paper, When Twice as Good Isn't Enough. And then it's also a place for the 3C Fellows program. So we're currently soliciting for that. We'll start February through June. And that will be for any educators, graduate students, or industry professionals who are interested in learning more about identity in computing, how to create courses around it, course modules, and other activities that can impact their departments and universities and students in ways that are more meaningful and engaging and sustaining. So I would say those are the main two. If anyone's interested in just following the crazy that is my mind across a day, I'm always on Twitter. So I'm at Dr_Nicki W on Twitter. Those are pretty much the three easiest ways to reach me. Between any one of those sites, I'm always around.
And with that, that concludes this week's episode of the CSK8 podcast. Friendly reminder to visit the show notes to check out many of the resources that were discussed in this particular episode. And if you haven't done so, please consider sharing this episode or your favorite episode with another colleague in CS education. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode. Stay tuned next week for another Unpacking Scholarship episode and 2 weeks from now for another interview. I hope you're all having a wonderful week and staying safe.